the world, throngs of people hailed the end of the war in Europe. It is 5 years and more since Hitler marched into Poland. Years full of suffering and death and sacrifice. Now the war against Germany is won.
When the guns of World War II fell silent, the world of the 20th century faced stark new realities. More people had died in this conflict than in any other war in mankind's history. Over 23 million soldiers were killed in combat. Nearly 40 million civilians perished. And 11 million people, including 6 million Jews, had been systematically murdered by the Nazis and their collaborators. The economies of Europe were devastated. Much of the infrastructure was destroyed. Borders had been redefined. And democracy, new nationalism, communism and its conflict with capitalism were the forces of the emerging New World Order. And for the Jews, once again, their faith had been tested, their world shattered, and their future uncertain. Destiny Films presents Faith and Fate, the story of the Jewish people in the 20th century. Episode 6, The Miracle of Israel, 1945 to 1948.
In the aftermath of the Holocaust, the European heartland of Ashkenazic Jewry was now one vast Jewish graveyard, with 6 million Jews dead and hundreds of thousands more left homeless, stateless, and traumatized by their awful experiences. Now, with the Germans defeated, the rest of the world was about to see for themselves what Hitler's final solution really meant.
When we entered the camp, it was like a nightmare. The first sight was all the dead people blocking the camp entrance. They were laying on their backs because they were shot with a 50 caliber machine gun. And I saw the body. I couldn't understand that this was alive just a couple of hours ago before the Germans ran away.
I was stunned. There was 10 to 15,000 dead when we came in. Walked further into the camp. Oh my gosh. As if the dead were walking. As if their bones were kept together by sinews of skin.
I was just completely torn. I said, no one's going to believe what I see now. And that's the truth. No one did believe me. I radioed back to my colonel, and he said he was going to let General Eisenhower hear about it, and I'm sure he's going to be there. He was astounded. He couldn't believe what he saw.
I find it riveting to this day, and to his credit, that
one of his first directives says, I want now that reporters and cameramen come immediately to film what we see here. One, so the world should know. And two, these are the words pregnant with meaning, because years later people will deny this ever happened. The first thing that really began to shake people's consciousness were the movie reels that were shown in Piccadilly Square and Times Square and Paris. And then people couldn't deny it anymore.
Across the earth, the pictorial record which the world had seen of German death camps would not be readily forgotten either. Nazi officials like Joseph Kramer, the Beast of Belsen, have already paid with their lives for the crimes they committed against innocent men, women, and children.
People were dying regularly after the so-called liberation because, for example, the troops didn't have the proper food to sustain these people and gave them food that was far too rich. The Soviet Red Army was far better because they had much more of an understanding, and therefore they provided the right foods immediately.
The Allies immediately initiated military tribunals against those responsible for the war and the Holocaust.
That all the defendants participated as organizers or accomplices in a common plan or conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity.
This order, dated 16 September...
At the main trial at Nuremberg, former center of the Nazi Party rallies, 24 leading German Nazis and 6 criminal organizations, including the leadership of the Nazi Party, the SS, the Gestapo, and the High Command of the German Army, were brought to justice for their war crimes against humanity. However, Hitler and 2 of the main perpetrators, Goebbels and Himmler, committed suicide at the end of the war, escaping trial and certain execution.
While bringing war criminals to justice was important for the survivors, reconnecting to any remnant of family, finding a home and rebuilding their shattered lives, these were the immediate issues of the day. When the camps were liberated, the survivors literally walked through the open gates with only the clothes on their back, and worse, with little or no information of what had happened to their families, their communities, and their loved ones.
Gradually, slowly, we realized we were what you might call free. Except what did freedom mean under those conditions? There were no vehicles to take us away. We had no road maps. We were left, abandoned, to go somewhere. And everyone wanted to go back to their home base to see who else had survived.
What happened to my people? What happened to my family, my cousins, my uncles, the great-uncles, aunties? There were absolutely nobody. Not a distant cousin, absolutely nobody.
Our families were killed. Our homes were no longer. Nobody had any family. No place to go back to.
And I went back to our house, and I found the floorboards ripped up, and my mother had jewelry there and money in case we come back. Of course, there was nothing there. Windows broken, doors taken off. There was nothing of home, nothing left at all.
There were no psychiatrists, no psychologists. Nobody debriefed us from the trauma of 6 years. There were no support systems. You know, in any type of tragedy, there's a support system. Nobody was there. No country wanted us. But worst of all, there was no family waiting.
But it was not only the world of Ashkenazic Jewry that was destroyed by the Nazis. With the complicity of the Balkan states, Italy, and Greece, Sephardic Jewry did not escape the ravages of the Holocaust.
When the war was over, the Sephardic Jews of France were gone. The Sephardic Jews of Holland were gone. By gone, I mean had been murdered. The Jews of Sarajevo, Sephardic Jews of Europe, the Greek diaspora of 500 years in the Balkans was gone. The Sephardic Jews of Greece, in one of the most total and rapid deportations within a 4-month period, were annihilated, usually at the entry to Auschwitz. After World War II, about 2/3 of Sephardic Jewry had been annihilated in Europe, but the entire civilization had been destroyed.
It is a horrible thing to live every day with the knowledge that you might not live to see another day.
I'm still haunted today. There isn't a day or 2 days should go when a certain thought doesn't come to my mind from the past. Anybody who was in a position like I was, and if he tells you he's totally normal, he's a liar.
Understandably, for many, their suffering and the tragedy of the Holocaust was a test of faith too hard to bear. And their belief in God, challenged to breaking point, died with them or their loved ones in the flames of Nazi destruction. For many of the survivors, the Zionist dream of a Jewish homeland was their anchor of hope. For others, it was their determination to rebuild their lives with material security and safety. And yet for others, the faith that has sustained them through their darkest days became the building block of recreating a Torah life wherever they could.
For those of us living today, especially in relative affluence and luxury, it is virtually impossible to fully relate what happened to the Jewish people during the Holocaust. In reality, we are still in a traumatic state over it. The only answers and sources of comfort that we do have is to look back into our history, to what has happened to us before, and to remind ourselves of God's promise of Jewish survival and ultimate triumph. For me, especially from a Jewish perspective, there is no greater inspirational story in the 20th century than the story of faith after the Holocaust. To understand in some way how people could have had this faith, despite everything. It is the way to begin to understand the core strength of Jewish survival throughout Jewish history.
Faith during the Holocaust was so important, because in the most difficult times, you saw how everybody is killed in front of you. You saw you did not have food. It was so horrible. The only thing actually that kept you going was your faith.
Many people lost it. Many. And many of the secular people committed suicide by going to the fires. I knew why I was in Auschwitz. I was a Jew. I knew how Rabbi Akiva died, what the Jews have undergone throughout the 2,000 years. That secular Hungarian Jew, he didn't know why he was in Auschwitz. Didn't make sense to him.
when we were lined up in Auschwitz, separating, people who to the gas chamber and who to life, my father was very worried about me. He called my name twice. Shendele, Shendele. Continue to believe in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Continue to believe in the Torah. Continue to believe in all the mitzvot and keep them. And whatever happens, take in faith the Yisurim, the tortures of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and never turn away from him. That gave me a lot of strength, a lot of strength.
My father said, we must have trust in God, trust in Hashem Baruch. That meant to me that his face wasn't broken yet. He knew where he was going. He knew that he was going to be taken back to Auschwitz, which meant to be thrown into the gas chambers. But he still said that we must have faith. That's the last time I have seen my father.
God's spirit is in everybody. This spirit goes back to the source. God, in his own way, he took people's life. Every human being will have a reckoning day. But a man who was around there, who died there in a concentration camp, reckoning is over. And he's given the highest award of heaven because he died for the sake of God.
The way I think of faith is like an eggshell. It's a fragile thing. And you have to hold on to it. I mean, it can withstand a lot of pressure, but then the slightest thing can shatter it. I had grave questions of the purpose of life. If this is what life has to offer, what's the point? And if there was a point, I had to find it and make a decision. It wasn't a decision up here, it was a soul decision to attach myself to the rope of Jewish history and Jewish belief. It was my act of rebellion against the forces of destruction. It was my act of affirming that I am alive and that because I'm alive, I had an obligation to make the rest of my life meaningful and purposeful. And I had to give my children something more than a history of destruction.
And my sister said, where was God? How can that be? And I am not going to do anything. I'm not going to keep Shabbos. I'm not going to... And I thought, she is right. And my brother says, well, can you imagine? It was like hitting back at God, God forbid, such a thing. But we felt so bitter and so terrible. But we weren't normal, you know. We were very highly strung and peculiar. And when Pesach came, it was automatic. We said, what are we going to do about Pesach? And my sister said, we're going to chuck out all the dishes we have, all the saucepans. We're going to buy new things, and we'll have a proper Pesach. And the smiles on my brothers and sisters' face, it was like a relief. Suddenly we're allowed to become normal, you know?
And my father said, you saw how your mother was killed, 2 of your brothers. You saw how the rabbi was buried alive. And you saw everything. My child, you must remember and you must tell about it. But my child, ubacharta b'chaim, you must choose life.
In the hospitals, I got myself books and taught myself partly English, German, mathematics, and physics. And it is my faith that helped me along all those years that I started out from nothing, and then I got my bachelor's, then my PhD, and all my life I was a professor of physics. My work is found in every science library of the world. My faith has been with me all along. If it weren't for my face, I couldn't have reached what I have reached. When I look at my grandchildren, when I look at my children, my sons who are full of Torah and secular education and so on and so forth, it's only my face that carried me along all those years.
Every survivor's story of faith is a living testament of triumph over evil. It is a far more powerful and positive message to tell over to our children how the Jewish people have continued and survived and grown despite what has happened to us.
All these survivors, these saved remnants, they scattered like seeds in the wind, like dandelion seeds being blown all over the place. And like dandelion seeds, they implanted themselves in towns, in cities, in countries all over the world. And they began to be busy with building lives.
Meanwhile, amidst the confusion and chaos after the Holocaust, there were individuals and groups of survivors who concentrated their efforts not only on themselves, but on finding and saving other Jewish survivors throughout war-ravaged Europe. Orphans, children hidden with non-Jews to save them from the Nazis, broken remnants of families. Individual by individual, they began to rebuild lives and communities. With limited means and hardly any institutional funding, but fired by the belief that it could be done, many of them succeeded beyond anyone's imagination.
Today, throughout the Jewish world, there are many vibrant Jewish communities built from these shattered remnants. For example, here in Israel, there's the great Sanz community in Netanya, single-handedly rebuilt by the Klausenberger Rebbe, Rabbi Yekutiel Yehuda Halberstam, whose own wife and children perished in the Holocaust. The Rabbi of Ponevezh, Rabbi Yosef Kahaneman, built the great yeshiva in Bnei Brak against the odds of it ever being successful. And in the United States and Israel and throughout the diaspora, the great Hasidic courts of Bovov, Satmar, Skver, etc., and the Lithuanian yeshivot, to a great extent, their success today is greater than what it was in Europe before the war.
After the war, the Allies faced a major humanitarian crisis. The economies and societies of war-torn Europe were devastated. Millions of refugees had to be repatriated to their countries of origin. For 1 million other refugees, including the Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, there was no home to go to. Some did try to go home, but even after the terrible persecutions and events of World War II, anti-Semitism continued to prevail in most parts of Europe, especially Poland.
There were people in Poland that were very anti-Semitic against us, very anti-Semitic against us. They really felt they want our land, they want our buildings, they want our money, they want everything. The Poles attacked us, 120 Poles. They were upset that we survived, and this is why we were hiding upstairs. But then they discovered our place and they opened the door, and my mother stood up with the baby. I was sitting behind her. She knew them. She said, "Kill me first, not my child." They killed the baby first and my mother, and she fell on top of me.
In one incident in the city of Kielce in south-central Poland, 64 Jews awaiting transfer to Palestine were murdered in a pogrom.
It was a group of Poles who made a pogrom of the remaining Jews in Kielce. And they went out with axes and they wanted to kill the people. That a pogrom can still happen after the war is to end was a terrible shock for us.
This pogrom occurred slightly more than a year after the war had ended in Europe. How could this be? After more than 3 million Jews were systematically killed as Polish citizens, and millions of others coming from other countries were killed on Polish soil, how could a Polish mob attack and kill Jews in this way? One of the consequences was that the several hundred thousand, maybe 300,000, 350,000 Jews who had come back and were living in Poland decided at that point it was no longer a viable place for Jews to live.
For a brief period after the war, impoverished Polish, Lithuanian, and Russian Jews who had been exiled into Central and Asiatic Russia during the war were allowed to leave the Soviet Union. To cope with all the refugees, displaced persons camps were set up by the Western Allies in order to accommodate stateless and homeless survivors.
DP camps were set up for displaced persons. At that time, we were known as the Sherit HaPleitav, the saved remnant. And it's actually a biblical, it's a prophetic statement. And they used the Jewish way of describing us, which was the saved remnant, because we were saved. We were saved from what we didn't know yet.
By this time, world Jewry, who could do little to help their brethren during the war, began to coordinate their efforts, and Jewish organizations worldwide came to the aid of the stricken survivors. The American Joint Distribution Committee and its British counterpart, the Jewish Relief Committees, set up food distribution centers, medical facilities, and schools.
It wasn't only organizations that came to their aid. Individuals from all over the world volunteered and went to the DP camps to assist their fellow Jews.
Under the prodding of people like Rabbi Alexander Rosenberg and other rabbis who were attached to the United States Army, the American Army printed a Shas, an entire set of the Babylonian Talmud, so that Jews would have a Talmud to study. It was a remarkable thing that Jews asked for it, and it was even more remarkable that the American Army saw fit to do it, because you have to rebuild the people, and you can't just rebuild them with chocolate bars. You have to rebuild their inside. You have to rebuild their faith. You have to rebuild their purpose in life. Without a Talmud, the Jews found it very difficult to have such a purpose.
To help the survivors with their greatest need, finding out who in their family was still alive and where they were, Jewish relief organizations, together with the Red Cross, began the long process of coordinating lists of Jewish survivors and posting them in every camp.
They always used to put out fresh list every day, the people who survived, who came back. And all of a sudden I see there my sister on that list.
My mother was running around from office to office. There were postings, people were producing lists of people they had encountered along the way, people they had encountered in a camp somewhere, people they actually saw die.
People wrote letters to so-and-so DP camps in Germany. We didn't know where, when, what. And these were carried from place to look for relatives all over the world. And my older sister got one of those letters, and she came back to Hungary.
My sister I met in Siget. She was crying and thinking she came home and she has nobody in the world. And here, all of a sudden, she sees me coming just across the street, and she started to scream. And since then, we were inseparable.
Even after all they had suffered, the survivors were now facing a stark new reality, that of being rejected and unwanted.
There was a boy of 16 in Bergen-Belsen who said to us, "Everybody has a home. The Americans have a home, the French have a home, the British have a home. Only we don't have a home." We must go to Palestine.
But for the desperate survivors, returning to Palestine was not possible. The British, who controlled the country, remained adamant. Their official immigration policy, as stated in their White Paper of 1939, continued to severely restrict Jewish immigration to Palestine.
The British passed this White Paper, which put the end to the pledge of the Balfour Declaration of November 1917, where Britain had pledged itself to facilitate, as the language had it, the establishment of a Jewish national homeland in Palestine. How so? By saying that within the next 5 years, only 75,000 Jews would be permitted to enter the Holy Land, thereafter with Arab consent. Everybody realized that no Arab, given a free choice, would allow any Jew to come into Eretz Israel. That's the White Paper of 1939, which, alas, remained in force throughout the war.
One of the forgotten facts of the history of Palestine is that the British White Paper of 1939 went against the terms of the mandate given to Great Britain to rule the country.
The League of Nations Permanent Mandates Commission, by a majority vote in May and June 1939, said the White Paper ran counter to the original British pledge of the Balfour Declaration and the mandate. So in effect, the British, by merrily doing thereafter what they wanted, acted in an illegal fashion according to the League of Nations.
History is full of broken promises. In reality, the British, serving their own self-interests, actually turned against the Jews that they were meant to help. In 1922, the British gave 3/4 of Palestine to the Arabs, which later became Transjordan and then Jordan, and ignored their League of Nations obligation to create a homeland for the Jews. But throughout the Second World War and right up to 1948, they forcibly restricted Jewish refugees from entering their promised land. It's unbelievable. The British had the audacity to call the survivors illegal immigrants, when in fact it was their actions that were totally illegal. But who was there to police the British? The League of Nations itself was dissolved at the onset of World War II, and almighty Britain was left free to do exactly what it wanted to in Palestine.
The rest of the country will do as well as the Barrel Stepney.
In 1945, Clement Attlee became British Prime Minister, his Labour government sweeping away the wartime leadership of Winston Churchill.
The Labour Party had come in, and in Palestine there was such joy because the Labour Party for years had said, we don't like what the British are doing there and we're going to change it, and they let it be known they were going to continue making it a homeland for the Jews. But as soon as they came into power, they changed, and it became exactly the way it was under the Tories.
So the British were afraid, as their secret memoranda indicated, we don't want to have a flood of Jews coming to the Holy Land. They feared it would jeopardize their relations with the Muslim world, jeopardize oil interests in Iraq and elsewhere. It's ironic that in our greatest hour of need, the doors to the promised land, promised also by the Balfour Declaration, were barred shut.
The dominions of the British Empire, Canada, South Africa, New Zealand and Australia followed Britain's lead, restricting immigration of Jews into their countries, as did countries in most of the rest of the world. In the United States, the Johnson Act of 1924, which restricted immigration to America, was still in effect after the war. Despite restrictions, there were Jewish refugees that managed to find their way to America and other countries. The majority were not so fortunate. For the desperate survivors still in the DP camps, with the world turning its back on them, there seemed to be no solution to their plight.
There were some good-natured liberals who said, let the Jews go back to their homes after the war, and that will prove that we are setting up a good democratic world, having defeated Hitler and his minions. Go back to what homes? On the blood-soaked soil of Europe? That was absurd.
In Palestine, David Ben-Gurion and the Jewish Agency saw the desperate situation of the refugees as a unique opportunity to bring pressure to bear on world opinion.
Ben-Gurion came to the camps to bring the message of Palestine. And he thought that he is going to find broken people, people without hope. They were not Zionists before the war. Their Zionism was not ideological. They had their own life experience. And their life experience was that their neighbors did not want them, and that European society did not care about their fate. And they wanted to be among Jews. They understood they don't have another possibility, another way of rehabilitating their own lives. And the idea of the Jewish state gave them two things. First of all, it gave them purpose. It gave them something to look forward to. And second, it gave them hope.
When Ben-Gurion, already visiting the DP camps in the winter of 45, said to them openly, I have nothing in my pocket to give you, but I have a promise. Remember the Hatikva, our national song, that one day you will arrive and will do everything to do it. That meeting ended with the sing of the Hatikva.
He came away from the camps with the feeling that these people, he understood, were ready to fight for the Jewish state because this was a fight for their own life.
The situation for the Jewish refugees in the DP camps was intolerable. With pressure, especially from the Zionists, world indifference and opinion began to change.
To his everlasting credit, Truman, prodded by Morgenthau, who's prodded in turn secretly by Zionists, sends Earl Harrison, a non-Jew, prominent dean of the University of Pennsylvania Law School, to the camps to see what's going on. Harrison is so bowled over that he reports back to Truman, we're treating the Jews here even worse than the Nazis did. And he recommends what the Zionists had already recommended Weizmann to Churchill in October 44, right after the war, 100,000 Jews to Eretz Israel. Somehow that magic number of 100,000 keeps reappearing. And Truman, uncharacteristically for an American president, bites the bullet on the spot. Contacts his opposite number, Attlee, who says, Clement, don't you think we should send 100,000 of these people to Palestine and then we'll solve the problem of the Jews? That's a humanitarian response. He's not pro-Zionist at this point. The British are shocked. They weren't expecting this. So Attlee turns to his counterpart vis-a-vis foreign affairs, that's Ernst Bevin, foreign secretary, and the cabinet, this is Attlee and Bevin mainly working together, come up with the decision, well, let's form an Anglo-American Commission of Inquiry.
The Anglo-American Commission of Inquiry into Palestine consisted of 6 British and 6 American members.
And we went from one DP camp to another and got all these stories, and you could see it affecting the members of the committee. They broke up. Some went to Poland, some went to Germany, and then we went on to Jerusalem, and Dr. Chaim Weizmann, who later became the first president of Israel, and was the first one to testify. And he told the committee that there had to be a homeland, that everything he had been telling them would happen was now happening.
And he was so impressive that you wondered how anybody could not believe what he was saying.
All 12 members unanimously recommended that 100,000 refugees be sent to Palestine, and that Palestine should become a binational state, guaranteeing safety for Jews and Arabs alike under international trusteeship.
The Zionists were in a quandary. We want 100,000, we certainly don't want binationalism. The Arabs were certainly opposed because they want it all. They certainly don't want 100,000, they don't want binationalism.
The recommendation of the committee came as a shock to the British government, and they immediately rejected the plan.
The Jews should establish a monument to commemorate Ernest Bevin, the British foreign minister, because of his obstinacy. Because had he agreed to the influx of 100,000 Jews to Palestine, maybe the whole question of the Jewish national home, of the Jewish state, would evaporate. Because people would say, okay, we have solved the question of the survivors, we gave them the 100,000 that they demanded, and that's the end of the story. But the British would not do that. Ernst Bevin would not allow one additional Jew to the 75,000 promised in the white paper of 39.
Ernest Bevin's actions can be viewed as yet another example of heaven's hidden hand in Jewish history. Just like the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and Pharaoh would not allow the Jews to go to the Holy Land, Bevin's heart was also hardened against the survivors returning to the very same Holy Land. It is ironic. Bevin's intransigence steal the will of the survivors, and it was now their persistence against British injustice that influenced world opinion and eventually led to the creation of the State of Israel.
Throughout the war in Palestine, there had been ongoing disagreement between the two Zionist camps on how to deal with the British. Chaim Weizmann, David Ben-Gurion, and the Jewish Agency, who had maintained a truce with them throughout the war, believed the road to a Jewish homeland was through political expediency, pressure, and negotiation. On the other side, there were two underground militant organizations. The Irgun, led by Menachem Begin, a Polish immigrant whose parents were murdered in the Holocaust, and its breakaway, the extreme anti-British Lehi, started by Avraham Stern. Both the Irgun and the Lehi felt the only way to get a Jewish homeland was to fight for it.
The British were our enemies. Enemies in any way you can name it. They worried about the oil, they wanted Arab sympathy, and they backed them. At that time, they blocked the way for the Jews in Europe to come here, and more than 50% of world's oil fields were in the Middle East owned by the British, and that was a very good reason why they needed this land for their empire. But we didn't care about that. We needed our land for our freedom.
The unrelenting policy of the Jewish freedom fighters was armed resistance, getting rid of the British by force. They attacked them wherever they could and however they could.
At the same time, Ben-Gurion actually didn't believe that we can kick out the British from here, and that's why he thought that what we did was dangerous for the relations with the British.
The inflexible attitude of the British changed their relationship. Although Ben-Gurion, Weizmann, and the Jewish Agency could not officially alter their position, unofficially through their military wing, the Haganah, they joined forces with the Irgun and the Lehi.
The United Resistance Movement, created after October 45, when the British continue basically the white paper, restrict Jewish immigration even after the Holocaust into Eretz Israel, led to the unity of the armed different groups in Eretz Israel. They worked together for the first time, blowing up railroads, bridges leading to Eretz Israel, British boats trying to intercept, and radar stations also.
It was very difficult to fight the British. We were few all over the country, and the British had about 100,000 troops, soldiers and policemen in this country. We didn't have proper arms to fight such an empire. The only way to get arms was by breaking into British camps to get arms from their stores, and we knew that by that we sacrificed lives. It was a painful way to get arms, but we had to do it.
Ignoring the unbending policy of the British against Jewish immigration, the Zionist escape movement in Europe, the Bricha, with the covert help of the French and Italian governments, stepped up its clandestine efforts to smuggle Jewish refugees to Palestine. In the summer of 1946, more than 4,000 immigrants were smuggled into Palestine. They were moved secretly in small groups across Europe, from country to country, on foot and in disguised trucks.
They told us that in the evening we are going to cross the border between Hungary and Romania. We were all sitting pushed together, covered by blankets, that nobody should see that these are human beings. The people who were supervising the border were paid by the Zionist movement a nice sum of money, and they closed their eyes and they let the trucks to go over to Romania.
It was a treacherous journey over thousands of miles of difficult terrain, under constant threat of detection. And when they arrived at ports in Italy or France, they were crowded into decrepit old boats that the Zionists had purchased clandestinely to smuggle the survivors into Palestine.
We went to the port city of Constanza, and we saw from far away, and we were thinking, my God, a ship like this, is for the animals, it's not for human beings. But in the same token, who cares? As long as we are going to get Bezrat Hashem to Eretz Israel.
The British could not stop the ships at the ports of embarkation because France and Italy did not cooperate with them. And they could not allow the ships to Palestine because this would be the end of the white paper policy that the Arabs would not agree to.
The British, however, soon committed overwhelming forces to counteract further immigration. They mobilized 80,000 British troops, as well as the bulk of the Mediterranean fleet of the Royal Navy, to prevent the immigrants from entering Palestine. Ignoring international law, the British set up a naval blockade, stopping and boarding the immigrant ships in mid-ocean. Taking control of them, they escorted the ships into Palestine, where the refugees were sent to a detention camp in Atlit, a small village outside Haifa. Of the 63 boats that attempted to break the British blockade, only one officially succeeded.
We were coming near to Haifa, and then after a few hours, we see some huge army boats coming towards our boat. And they took their microphone and they were calling to us, we are the British occupiers of Palestine. You cannot enter the country. Our leaders told us, don't be afraid. We will get to Eretz Israel. You just go all on the deck of the ship and cry. which one was not difficult for us to cry, and beg them that you went through the hell, which one is all true, and you want to come to this country because you need to recover from all the hardship, that you lost your parents, you have nobody, you're young, you're not coming here as soldiers. So after a few hours of discussion between the leaders of our boat, our ship, and between the British Army, we were given the permission to come to the port of Haifa. The lines of people were unbelievable waiting at the port. This was the first boat to arrive to Israel after the war. They wanted to see whose children are alive, whose relatives remained.
There were 63 boats that made it from the cursed ground of Europe on the way to Eretz Israel, stopped by the British. 52,000 Jews on those boats. They endangered everything, their lives. But they knew the risk was certainly worth it, far better than what preceded them in Europe.
Every month, according to the quota of the White Paper, the British released 1,500 Jewish refugees from Atlit into Palestine. But the immigrants continued to arrive, and the camp soon became overcrowded beyond its capacity. In the summer of 1946, the British decided to deport the immigrants to Cyprus. They hoped that these detention camps would act as a deterrent, but they didn't. The immigrant ships kept coming, and the confrontations between the desperate survivors and the British often turned violent. The most infamous incident involved the 4,500 survivors on the immigrant ship, the Exodus.
The English intelligence got to know about the plan, and as we came out from France, they were there.
Daily they would approach us, they would say, in the name of His Majesty's government, we know that you are Jewish illegal refugees. Please turn around, go back, because you will not be allowed to land at your destination. By the time we reached the last day, there were 7 British ships around us.
When they came to the conclusion that we are not heeding their command, they rammed the ship.
The British boats were sandwiching us in now, and our boat was lifted up into the air. And we heard the boards of our ship cracking, splintering.
The water went in and people were standing until here in water, the people that were on the lowest deck.
Soldiers, helmets on, each of them had a shield in his hand, and they were ready to jump from their boat, but 800 hands were raised and 800 cans of goods were flying in the direction of the British, and within a few seconds the British decks on the 2 sides were cleared. The soldiers ran away because there was an overwhelming response, cheers of the young people. And that was the first time that our people could give expression to their frustrations of all those years. You see, now we were fighting back. You see, that was a great moment.
There was a battle that was maybe 1.5 to 2 hours until the English just threw in tear gas, and we didn't see anything.
A young fellow threw himself at the grenade and threw it back at the British boat. Now the British saw that he picked up the grenade and they killed him.
Additionally, the first mate of the Exodus was killed, and many refugees were injured. Now, under British control, the crippled exodus was taken into Haifa port.
All of a sudden, from one of the rooftops comes the melody of the Hatikva. And then when the shore stopped singing, the front of our boat picked up the Hatikva. And it was to the melody of Hatikva that the boat sailed into Haifa. It was a great moment.
It was the most tearful, the most screaming Hatikva that can be. All those people, everyone with his bundle of suffering that he went through, and here you see Palestine and the English are at your back.
In Haifa, any hopes the survivors had of staying in Palestine were dashed. They were met by British troops, who immediately transferred them to 3 waiting ships that had been refitted and fenced in to prevent any resistance. The survivors thought they were being deported to the internment camps in Cyprus. However, the British had decided to ship them back to France as a deterrent against illegal immigration.
In the harbor of Dubuque, France, another act of the drama unfolds as the Runnymede Park, one of 3 ships bearing 4,500 refugees, the displaced persons removed from the Exodus, bound for Palestine, refused to land in France.
Lo nazuz mipo, we will not move from here. Israel, only to Israel, only to Israel.
For 3 weeks, the standoff between the British and the survivors on the ships continued. Living conditions were deplorable. The refugees were crammed into overcrowded holes and endured stifling heat, yet they would not give in.
The British ran out of patience, and they said, if you will not leave the boat by the end of next day, then we are taking you to Germany.
It immediately created such an outrage around the world that hundreds of correspondents came to Port Taboo to cover this story. A story of a country sending these Jews who had suffered so much back to Germany, to the death land.
The irony is that the British plan backfired. The plight and resistance of the Exodus survivors swayed world opinion against the intransigent British and in favor of the Jewish cause. Seemingly, these refugees had come so far for so little. However, with only a glimpse of the promised land before being sent back to Europe, and armed only with their own will and determination, these saved remnants were a pivotal force in the fight for the Jewish homeland.
On another front in Palestine, the British had to face mounting pressure from the united resistance movement of the Haganah, the Irgun, and the Lehi.
We blew up their trains, police headquarters again and again, shot British policemen. Many of us were killed, many were wounded, many were arrested. My best friend, Alexander Rubovich, was tortured to death by the British. When he was 16 and a half years old, they tried to get from him information about his friends, about the organization, where we hide arms, where we meet. And they didn't get from him one word. I got wounded twice. Once badly in my head and blinded my right eye. And I want to tell you, it's nicer to see with 2 eyes, but it's much, much nicer to see our freedom with 1 eye than to see the British around ruling with 2 eyes.
The British realized that there was this united resistance. How do you capture the leadership of both the Haganah and the Jewish Agency and bring moderates into the picture, put an end to more militant Zionism? So they came up with a plan called Operation Agatha. which the Jews called HaShabbat HaShchora, the Black Sabbath, because it was on a Sabbath, the last one in June 1946, that the British raided not only the Jewish Agency building, but rounding up the Zionist leaderships and others, and the Haganah leadership.
Over 5,000 people, including almost all the leaders of the Yeshuv, were arrested, with the exception of David Ben-Gurion, who was out of the country, and Moshe Snare, the head of the Haganah, who managed to escape. The British then blockaded a large section of central Jerusalem to prevent further attacks. The Irgun were quick to retaliate. Their target was the British military headquarters at the King David Hotel in Jerusalem.
The Irgun put some explosives in milk cans underneath in the basement of the King David Hotel, according to its version, warning then the British, as they always did, and others around, an explosion is going to occur, vacate the hotel. It didn't happen. The British position was either their position, we never got the warning at the top, or B, we're going to take orders from the Irgun. And as a result, either way you see it, it led to a terrible tragedy.
The hotel housed the British Army headquarters and the Palestine government offices. The tragic scene is like a serious incident during the Blitz, and casualties were very heavy.
Almost 100 people were killed. This obviously soured the public, and the Haganah distanced itself immediately from the Irgun, saying we never gave any support, etc. And from that time on, the United Resistance Movement was over.
At this point in Palestine, with Jewish unity in disarray, increased British intransigence, and no foreseeable solution for the survivors in Europe, things seemed at their blackest for the Jews. But as throughout our history, as the Talmud teaches us, things may change at the blink of an eye. Yeshuat Hashem keheref ayin. The salvation of God comes to Israel in the blink of an eye.
There is a growing wave of support, humanitarian, simple as that, and with Truman as well. Eleanor Roosevelt, the #1 international woman in the world. I mean, it's clear, it's sent by Truman later to travel around the world as a goodwill ambassador. She comes to one of these decrepit, mud-filled, cold DP camps in Germany, and she doesn't speak the language of these people. She knows English. They're speaking all Yiddish. This is Mama Loshen. This is their mother's tongue. And an elder woman, she seems elderly. She could have been 40 years younger, given the horror she went through. She wants to get to Eleanor Roosevelt. And Eleanor Roosevelt writes that this woman cannot communicate with me in English, sinks to her knees in the mud, grasps me around my legs, looks at me imploringly and says, "Palestina, Palestina." Says Eleanor Roosevelt, that's the first time I understood that Jewish need and aspiration to come home, because there are no homes elsewhere.